Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that the passage points us to. Today I am joined by Sharon Schwartz, and we're looking at a passage from 1 Corinthians 7. So let's talk about how we get to 1 Corinthians 7. Chapter 1, verse 10 to chapter 6, verse 20 is kind of the first section of this letter. And it contains Paul's responses to issues that the church, where he had heard about things from Chloe's people, a group most likely from Ephesus that was familiar with situations in the Corinthian church. But beginning in verse 1 of chapter 7, he turns his attention to issues about which the Corinthians had recently wrote to Paul for clarification. So the previous issues he's answering questions or dealing with concerns from the people of Chloe's people. It's verse 1, chapter 7, he begins to talk about issues around that they had asked about. One of the issues regarded questions about celibacy versus marriage. Was it more holy for a person to live in celibacy and abstinence, or was marriage the more righteous choice for a believer? A related topic seems to be the question of whether sex, or even in the context of marriage, is a pure action or a negative practice. So celibacy is not a subject that we talk about very often, certainly not in the modern church or in our culture. If it is discussed, it's usually discussed in the context of whether ministers of certain we could say denominations or groups of Christians should be celibate or not. The fact is, Western Christians, especially in America, assume that celibacy has no spiritual value. And because we live in a highly sexualized culture, sex becomes the main perspective from which questions of celibacy and singleness are examined. So marriage and sex within marriage is preferable to singleness and celibacy in our culture. The question of whether a person can live single and not have sex rises almost to the level of absurdity in modern society. Our culture suffers from the Puritan idea that sex is categorically bad, that it is something of a necessary evil, necessary only for procreation. But is it possible, just possible, that American Christians privilege marriage over singleness and celibacy because it eases the tension that exists between traditional Christian views of human sexuality and the secular views of human sexuality? See, Paul clearly stated that he preferred to be single, and there's some debate about whether he was ever married, but by the time he's a believer, he's certainly not married by the time he's writing this. And interestingly enough, American Christians, we're often suspicious of male Christians who choose singleness as a way of life. We assume that something is wrong with that person. Some churches will not hire a single man as a pastor for fear that he might fall into temptation with a church member or that he might be gay. Perhaps there's a level of wisdom in such perspective. I think should be a conversation, or can be a conversation about those things. But it's ironic that the Apostle Paul himself would not fit into that mold for us as Christians today, and in the American church. So the question then becomes, is it a gift? Is celibacy a gift and a calling? Has our Western culture, Christian or Western Christian perspective, kept us from acknowledging that singleness can be a calling from God? Modern examples of men who have been effective while being celibate and single are John Stott and Henry Nouwen. And an interesting problem that is created in church ministry by this perspective is reflected in the fact that ministry to singles is often one of the most underdeveloped areas in church outreach. American churches tend to be geared more toward families. Do we have singles ministries only until we can get them married and move them into a different category? And so these questions about singleness and celibacy cannot be dismissed as if the Bible is simply irrelevant or it's outdated because of our modern culture. Paul did not make such statements about celibacy and marriage to a culture that was chaste and abstinent. The city of Corinth was known as the chief city for prostitution. Temples and brothels were everywhere, both female and male prostitutes. Sex was so readily available in the city that a proverb was known among the sailors: not for every man is the voyage into Corinth. Paul plainly stated in verse 2, there is so much sexual immorality. So they understood it was a sexual culture. So it's not like there's a bunch of, pure people that they're living among. So he's well aware of the audience to whom he's writing. And it's unlikely that the culture in Corinth was less sexual than the one in America. As a matter of fact, I've seen some of those historical ruins over there, and you'd be surprised at how blatant some of those things would be. The text behind Paul's writing makes it clear that he is also well aware of the natural God-given sex drive that that has been created in every person. His words weigh sexual self-control against the incredible temptation of sexual immorality, yet he clearly does not categorize celibacy as abnormal. This passage does imply that there are some positives for somebody who chooses to remain single. There seems to be this implication that someone who is truly gifted to be single also has a unique ability to control their passions. Paul makes it plain that singleness without celibacy is not an option for believers. Okay, so if you can't be celibate, then you shouldn't be single. They are free from another reason, a positive, he says they're free from concerns of life and the responsibilities that are involved in a marriage relationship. And in these last days, they are able to devote themselves more wholly to ministry. So, Sharon, you struck the luck of the draw with this.
I know it.
This one.
God's got a sense of humor.
Yeah. What are some of our assumptions as believers about a person who's chosen to be single?
When I first saw that question, I had a knee-jerk reaction. And it was so unfair. It made me start a random poll. And I've done a survey about 80 people. And about 90% of them, if you say knee-jerk, if you meet a man in his 50s and he's never been married, why? 90% say a man is because he's gay.
Mm-hmm. Men only, though. They don't make that assumption about women.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then I said, same thing about a woman. 50-year-old woman. Why has she never married? And it's not as black and white. About 75% said she was scarred somewhere in her past. There's been some kind of trauma in her life, either some kind of abuse or her family. There's been what I call trauma. Mm-hmm. And then it goes down from there. And the truth is, that's exactly the two things I thought. And that's not fair.
Right.
It's not. But that's the reality. And the second for a man is a financial thing. He doesn't want to share his assets, which I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. And a woman is the second when she didn't find anyone or no one asked her. That was nowhere in the man's. Mm-hmm. So, it was very interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, so I had an aunt. Well, I had two aunts. They both lived at home. My one aunt got married in her 30s. If I remember right, she was 38 and he was 21, if I remember right. They're still married. She's 84 maybe, and he's in his late 60s. That much I know. So but I think I'm right about the ages. Her sister, the interesting thing was they lived with my grandparents. My grandmother and grandfather slept in separate rooms, and my grandmother would say because he snored, and she was probably right. And the two sisters slept in the same bed together, as long as I can remember. And then one got married, and the other one still stayed at home. And she did not get married until her 50s, right? I never knew her to have a boyfriend, never knew her to talk to anybody, never knew. Now, looking back, I would say there were some reasons why, like, I wouldn't have married her either.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Hard to get along with.
Well, I didn't think so. She loved me, like she treated us great. But I could see where she would have some characteristics where I'd go, dear Lord, no, I wouldn't want to be married with that. But I can only see that as an older adult,
right?
You know, where I can decipher those things. But I do think we assume, whether it's gay or scarred or nobody asks them or they want, that something's wrong.
Yeah.
We always make, I would say 100%, well, that's probably too strong. 99+% of the time, people make some kind of assumption that something is wrong. You know, something has happened. Something is wrong in the situation. Whether they're right or not is not true, but for whatever reason, we don't think in spiritual terms. Like this person
has chose.
Yeah. Now, I know a particular situation. This man's dead now. He was a preacher. As a matter of fact, I never saw him open his Bible when he preached. He could quote chapters at the time. Like, it was the most incredible thing. I remember one night watching him preach, and he would go and reading. He was on his second chapter of quoting, and he says, I messed up on verse 7 of like the previous chapter. He goes back to that verse, corrects what he says, and keeps right on going from there, repeats what. It was amazing. But when he got saved, his wife left him and divorced him. And he would have been a young man when he went in ministry. And I didn't know him until he was older. I guess my first knowledge of him, he would have been in his 50s. But I knew him right up until he was in his 80s. And he never remarried. And he said, God gave me one opportunity. And if she didn't want to get saved and come with me, I'm not marrying anybody else. And he lived alone. And he never complained about it. He never acted like it was a burden. I never thought of it as a spiritual vow when I was younger. Mm-hmm. But looking back, I can see, he believed that had he remarried, it would have crippled his influence. And what I believe, he would have had to compromise what his convictions were. Mm-hmm. And so instead of compromising his convictions, he chose to stay single.
I agree with that. It's, people ask me all the time, will you ever marry again? And I'm like, Jesus Christ would have to drop him right here and say, this is him,
mm-hmm. Come with a card.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is I'm at the place in my life. Now, saying that, I don't want to be alone forever. And mm-hmm. so I don't know how I accomplish both things, but I want to be able to do what I want to do for the Lord and not, this sounds so selfish, have to be accountable to someone else.
That is one of the reasons. That's one of the benefits that Paul lists here.
I didn't have to call anybody and say, "Look, it's 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock podcast, okay?"
Right.
You know, you can if I want to stay up all night praying for a child that's in the hospital, I can do that and not have somebody say, "Come to bed, come to bed, come to bed."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's one of the benefits that he says. They're not encumbered by the snares of this life. For the benefits that marriage offers, it also provides some encumberment.
Yeah, it does.
And we can't take that away. There are certain cares and responsibilities and challenges that come from a family. So do you believe it's a spiritual gift? Do you believe people who are able to live a celibate life are gifted by God?
Spiritual gifts to me is something you get when you get saved. You're given a gift. I do think it's of God. I think, and I'll tell you why, because I'm human and I've been married, divorced, widowed again. And it would be very easy for me to be married for the advantages of it.
Right.
Okay. So when the Lord, or when I'm tempted by that, and the Lord allows that temptation, I turn to him. And it's not easy. But he fills that place. And I think that's something that's given from God. So spiritual gift, it is a gift from God. Because I really do not believe. I tell my kids and my grandkids and all children, you've got to make your mind up whether you're going to have sex before you crawl in the back seat of the car. Because by the time you get in the back seat, it's done.
Right.
I think if you're an adult and you're going to be single, you have to make a mental decision and a promise, a covenant with God that you're going to be celibate because it's commanded, and say, and I'm choosing you over the advantages of being married. I'm choosing you. And for a woman who's been celibate for 28 years, something like that, it's not always easy.
Don't slip up and make a mistake.
No,
It'd be a bad time to get your dates wrong.
No. That's we're in 24, so over 25 years. It's not easy, but it's worth it. And if he came right now and said, would you have done it different? And for the record, I've had opportunity to do it different. People laugh because I hi darling, hug on men and stuff. I'm attracted to you if I don't do that.
Right.
Because I don't trust the flesh. But he's worth it. And in that way, it is a God gift. So spiritual gift, depending on that translation, it is a godly gift. I do believe that.
Yeah, I have a friend who has never been married. I see them occasionally, but not very often. Oddly enough, they're a children's pastor. And they adopted 2 children later. She's in her 60s, without a doubt. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly in her 60s, still serving as a children's pastor. But she's never been married, ever. And may never be, at this point in life. Because, well, I don't want to go down that path, and it had nothing to do with her. But, you go through stages. When you're younger, yes, I should. When you're in that 35 to 55-year-old range, you might want to, but what you might pick up might be really damaged goods, right. But then as you get older, there's a lot more widows.
Right.
Right. Not just divorcees or people who couldn't make it work. So maybe not. But from the outside, she's been able to manage her life very well and ministry and, and do those things. And could I do it? Barbara and I have this conversation.
Never.
It's rare that men are more likely for the sexual temptations that he talks about, but also the things that men just don't want to deal with. Typically they want.
You don't want to do all the Christmas shopping.
Well, that wouldn't bother me. But yeah, I would have to hire a maid. Because I can walk right by it and not think about it. What I see is that men often find it more difficult to remain single than women do. Some of it may be the natural sexual urges that he talks about here, but that companionship, loneliness, that's the thing I hear mostly. You said I don't want to be alone the rest of my life.
Right.
And, you have had children and now grandchildren to raise
and great-grandkids.
Right, that keep your house buzzing, so that helps.
Yeah.
But were they all away,
it would be bad.
It would be difficult. It would be very, very difficult.
It would. And, it is a situation that you find whether it's worth it. And, you're talking about the children's pastor that had never married. One part of the thing I asked is, if there was a man that had been celibate 25 plus years and never had a female, even a friend, companion, someone he could take to weddings, someone he could, whatever, we would question even that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think anyone has ever thought, I wonder if Sharon's gay, and I don't know.
I never have.
I'm sure you haven't.
It's not crossed my mind.
And that, and it's, I think it's a wonderful thing, but I also think if you have a marriage and it's everything God wants it to be, that the sex in it is just a fabulous blessing.
Mm-hmm. It's not the reason why.
It's not the reason.
If that is the reason why.
It's the sprinkles on the cake.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, especially in Christian world, evangelical Christians have a tendency to want to get married to solve one problem, only to realize they've solved one problem and added 1,000 more that they didn't have. And I think that's one of the things he's addressing here. And we should be careful that we don't shame people. It may be God's plan for their life, and we have to trust God to work in that without assuming the worst. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation in the book of 1 Corinthians.